NBC29 is taking an in-depth look at Virginia's parole system, what works and what may not.
Some corrections industry leaders say the system is causing problems. Others disagree. 22 years ago, the Truth in Sentencing Act changed the system and required prisoners to serve at least 85% of their sentence before being considered for release. NBC29's Madison brings us part one of our series with how the policies impact prisons and jails.
It's really increased crowding, especially at local jails.
Corrections industry leaders say Virginia's prison and jail system is bursting at the seams. Former inmates say the current system only encourages a cycle of crime for many offenders.
A lot of stabbings, a lot of robberies, a lot of wine making, a lot of drug smuggling inside of the prison, a lot of drug dealing. You name it, it's happening.
Truth in Sentencing aimed to close the gap between a sentence a person receives in court and how much time they actually serve behind bars. But it came with some unintended consequences that have transformed the criminal justice system in Virginia. The act was put into place under Republican Governor George Allen in 1995.
Well, what we want to do is double the time that violent felons are serving in prison.
Inmates could no longer get earned sentence credit. That's time given through complying with the Department of Corrections policies and procedures. And only a maximum of 4.5 days could be earned for every 30 served.
The parole system that we have in Virginia is a fraudulent system in that when a judge or a jury sentences someone to 10 years or 12 years, they assume they're going to serve that time, and they end up serving just a fraction of their sentence.
The Truth in Sentencing Act required criminals to serve at least 85% of their sentence. A question concerning the program 20 years ago.
If you had to serve your full time, though, how many prisons you got?
Well, what we want to do is
one Allen couldn't answer. Now the question sits at the feet of Virginia's Department of Corrections. They say they don't have enough space to house all those prisoners.
When the DOC gets full, you can't send your local jails to DOC anymore, so local jails get backed up.
Colonel Martin Coomer, the superintendent at Albemarle Charlottesville Regional Jail, says the DOC is moving their overcrowded prison inmates to local communities and overcrowding the jails.
It's really impacted us, more so I would think than even the Department of Corrections.
The Justice Policy Institute reports local jails in Virginia operate at nearly 150% capacity at times, while state prisons are operating around 96% capacity. In 1980, Virginia had about 9,000 prisoners. By 2000, just 5 years after parole was abolished, prison population more than tripled. Today, Virginia's prison count still sitting at 30,000 because prisons are near capacity. That means more state inmates in local jails.
Anytime you have overcrowding inside of a jail, it leads to more assaults.
Thomas Jackson, better known as Zulu, grew up in Charlottesville. He spent 31 years of his life in and out of the system for drug-related offenses.
They allowed us during those times in the earlier years, to basically police ourselves. And they dealt with any violations from that. They gave you enough rope to hang yourself.
After parole went away, he says the inside looked a lot different.
It was all these no parole guys there, 85%ers. Yeah. And these 85%ers had the attitude of, hey, okay, no matter how I act and what little bit of good time they give me, it's not going to change my sentence that much. And they were really out of control.
Jackson and Coomer agree punishment has little effect on behavior.
These guys always don't respond well to sticks. People used, the punishment in all their lives, and that's pretty much what they know.
They say prison is rehabilitation. They say prison is an imposed sentence of punishment for a crime committed. The structural awareness when you get in there is that prison, is no different from where you came from. It makes no changes whatsoever in your life, if you opt into the system.
That was NBC29's Madison reporting. While the former inmates and jail leaders we just heard from say truth in sentencing is hurting the correction system, others believe the measure is needed. Tomorrow at 6 in part 2 of our series, Madison introduces us to advocates who say this act is making sure victims of and witnesses to crimes get real justice. We continue to take you through our in-depth look at what Virginia's truth in sentencing law has meant to both sides of a crime and to taxpayers.
Yeah, corrections experts say the law, which essentially abolished parole in Virginia, is filling our jails and prisons to capacity, and sometimes even more. They want to see a change, but supporters of the law say it protects victims. Now, in part 2 of our series, NBC29's Madison introduces us to advocates who say truth in sentencing needs to stay.
Put it this way, I don't think that the person who killed my cousin or other violent offenders like that deserve to breathe the same air that I do.
It is very easy for someone who's not going to be the victim of that crime to say, I think it's okay for someone else to have to pay that cost. But the impact on crime victims is routinely understated by people that propose lower sentences.
Attorney and Republican Delegate Rob Bell is adamant Virginia's current system under the Truth in Sentencing Act, which abolished parole, needs to be kept in place. For some victims, like Lori Crawford, now a victim witness advocate, there's no dollar amount to be put on putting offenders behind bars and keeping them there. In December of 1989, she was 16 with her cousin and 2 other friends in a car on their way home from a party.
All of a sudden, out of nowhere, we saw someone coming up to the driver's side window of the car and just shot in the driver's side window.
In a road rage incident, her cousin Jill West was murdered in the back seat by a bullet that missed its intended target, the driver of that car.
He got sentenced to 15 years, and he was up for parole after 3. And he was released, mandatorily released after 8.
Because truth in sentencing wasn't in place yet, Crawford relived the worst day of her life once a year.
You have to testify. Testifying is degrading. It's awful.
The offender never felt any remorse for what he did to the day he was released, and that was what was in his files. It was what the parole board knew that, and so they needed me to come up there and say, keep him in.
Until she says her words didn't matter to the parole board anymore.
As a 19-year-old was in college at UVA and was having to take trips up to Atmore Drive in Richmond and relive this experience in order to just keep him in that additional 5 years.
Before truth in sentencing, many violent criminals would serve less than half the sentence a jury handed down. A first-degree murderer would spend about 10 years behind bars and a 35-year sentence. A rapist, 4 years out of 9.
I really do make a distinction between violent and nonviolent offenders, and I'm not saying that there are definite problems with the fact that there are people who have a drug offense who serve way more time than someone who kills someone, and that's a real problem.
Even advocates of truth in sentencing say it's a flawed system and how it doesn't make distinctions between violent and nonviolent crime. Almar Charlottesville Regional Jail Superintendent Martin Coomer says it's a complicated problem.
And I know some people say you can't put a cost on a victim or a crime, but taxpayers can. If you tell them the real cost of what it would be, to eliminate recidivism, we're not willing to pay for it. I don't think there's enough money to pay for it.
All this week, NBC29 has put the parole system under the microscope.
We've heard how changes in law have impacted inmates, jails, and victims of crime. Tonight, NBC29's Madison Carter is live in studio with the final installment of our series on parole reform in the Commonwealth.
Yeah, that's right. Good evening, Steve and Casey. Those are new names for me. Well, so I crunched the numbers so you can get a better idea of what the Truth in Sentencing Act has done across the Commonwealth, what you, the taxpayers, are paying, and as well as those who worked in the system. So we spoke with the next governor as well to see what he intends to do with the system. Today, nearly 30,000 violent and nonviolent offenders sit in Virginia's prisons and jails, and the cost to taxpayers keeps rising.
You're not going to eliminate recidivism. Nobody is. The cost-benefit analysis is not there. The amount of money it would cost to do that, you would never realize that.
Each prisoner cost about $29,000 to house in 2016. That's up almost 4% from 2015. Taxpayers are spending close to $850 million for legislation that was put in place 20 years ago and is no longer bringing in federal grant money. Virginia lawmakers say they passed truth in sentencing guidelines in part because they were going to receive money from the federal government as an incentive for being tough on crime. Okay, well, in 1996, the state received $1.2 million from the federal government towards a corrections budget of nearly $542 million. And then in 2001, the financial incentive went away. The government stopped giving money to states that adhered to truth in sentencing guidelines. In fact, last year, Virginia only received $135,000 towards a corrections budget that had nearly doubled to $1 billion. And that money, that difference, is being made up by you, the taxpayers.
Most of these guys think in terms of today and maybe tomorrow morning. They don't think long term. That's one of the reasons why they're here. So to hang that over their head, 25 years from now, I'm going to knock a couple months off the end of your sentence. I'm like, okay, great.
Albemarle Charlottesville Regional Jail Superintendent Martin Coomer says having parole as an incentive for programming might help people stay off the streets by teaching them the skills they need inside.
But above that, to get these guys to become self-motivated, to participate in programming that will help them, they'll benefit them, it would be nice to have that carrot.
No matter how good you are, you're just going to get the 85%.
Mary Ann Stone is the vice chairwoman of the Richmond chapter of Virginia Cure, Citizens United for the Rehabilitation of Errants. She spent decades working to help prisoners re-enter society.
They depend too much on the inmates to do the release programs.
The Department of Corrections says it aims to help with successful re-entry into society, but people familiar with the system say the DOC may be missing the mark.
Well, if you've been locked up for 5 years, are you an expert in how to get out?
They don't try. They don't try because, like I said before, they're getting these great long sentences.
Charlottesville native Thomas Jackson, or Zulu, saw this happen with inmates around him during his decades in and out of the prison system.
And they're like, okay, well, hey, I might as well get better at what I do illegally rather than to get better or try to do something legal.
Others feel the $5.9 million Virginia spent on rehabilitative programming last year could be better spent helping people on the outside.
We had some sort of programs that's already in place for these guys when they first get out. And when they communicate with the outside, these guys is telling them, say, hey, look, man, I can't get a job. I can't get housing, clothing, food. So I'm doing this and I'm doing that. So you're wasting your time in there, trying to program because you ain't gonna have the opportunity when you get out. Successful transition don't exist.
In 2015, Governor Terry McAuliffe established a parole review commission to look at whether parole should be reestablished. That group gave 23 recommendations, but stopped short of recommending parole be reinstated. Governor-elect Ralph Northam wants truth in sentencing to stay.
So I think there are a lot of things that we can do to help keep people out of our jails and prisons, but I don't support going back on parole.
He says his emphasis will be on crime prevention and continuing the work of Governor McAuliffe in restoring felon rights.
We believe very strongly that once an individual has paid back their time that was given them by a judge or a jury, that the best thing that we can do for them to help them get back into society, get back into the workforce, is reinstate their voting rights.
So last month, the governor's office announced Virginia posted its lowest recidivism rate for the second straight year. But those rates are also in decline across the country. Some would argue fewer criminals on the street means fewer crimes, but one study shows the crime rate didn't budge after the year 2000, despite Virginia continuing to jail more people. Well, that same study shows the crime rate has very little to do with Virginia's incarceration practices. What has had an effect on reducing crime are prevention techniques. Those include the number of police officers, data-driven policing, that's looking at statistics to predict high crime areas or times, people drinking less alcohol, changes in community incomes, and people just getting older. So speaking of, there's one form of parole that often gets overlooked. That's called geriatric release. We're going to have some more information on that on our website, NBC29.com. You can also catch up on any of the parts 1 and 2 you might have missed. And there's one last thing I want to leave you guys with, and you as well, is obviously, story about parole. We didn't hear from the parole board here in Virginia. That's because after some months of back and forth with the parole chairwoman, she decided not to go on camera with us. But in a couple of off-camera interviews, Adrienne Bennett told me that she thinks that parole needs to be reinstated here in Virginia. So she disagrees with our governor-elect. She says that, quote, Commonwealth is tough on crime, but not smart on crime.
Not always one and the same.
Right. So it's interesting to see what will happen coming up next in this new administration.
Yeah, we'll find out.